these are critiques. They are also attacks on the enterprise of large ensembles, and they should be treated as such. That means that they're either legitimate attacks on some aspect of what we do that needs to change, and we need to acknowledge that it needs to change, or they're attacks that aren't legitimate and need to be challenged on those grounds.
Hello and welcome to episode 20 of the BandWagon podcast for the week of July 8th, 2024. On this edition of the program, news and notes from the band world, including a preview of a little professional development. And I have a conversation with a staunch defender of the large music ensemble. I'm your host, Rob Hammerton. Hello, dear listener. A quick intro this week, and come to think of it, a quick everything to make way for a longer than usual trio section. Generally, I try to have these episodes be 40 to 50 minutes if I can. I don't know, some kind of philosophy I came up with during the planning stages back in January. This week's conversation is so full of good stuff that, well, I had to keep a ton of it in, so the other segments will be quick hits by comparison. So, without further ado, let's play the first strain. In this episode's first strain, news and notes from the band world. Dateline Keene, New Hampshire. Band directors from New Hampshire and the surrounding New England states will converge on Keene State College for the annual New England Band Directors Institute Summer Professional Development Conference. NEBDI was founded in 1992 by the New Hampshire Band Directors Association, headed by then Plymouth State University Director of Bands, the late Gary Corcoran. This summer will be the second summer since the COVID pandemic that the three-day conference will take place. The conference is dedicated to music education at all levels, with highlights including reading sessions for band music, grades 1 to 5, and for jazz ensemble, as well as a combination reading session and rehearsal lab with a noted band composer or conductor. Past years have featured Anthony Maiolo, David Holsinger, Robert Sheldon, and Michael Markowski, among many others. This year's featured composer is Randall Standridge. NEBDI coordinator and Keene State College music professor Dr. John Hart reported that more than 100 participants have registered, which more than doubles last year's attendance. And that's this week's abbreviated news and notes from the band world. If you have a news item you think should be included in this segment, send me a link via email to heybandwagon@yahoo.com. Be right back. Okay, let's pick it up at the second strain. In this week's second strain, so that New England Band Directors Institute thing that was featured in the first strain, as you listen to this podcast, provided you're listening on July 8th, 9th, or 10th, I'll be there. I'm packing up my tenor sax and heading north. This is my 12th NEBDI, I think, and it's always a good time, and not just because it's New Hampshire and the scenery is spectacular, although it is. So who knows, maybe I'll talk podcast while I'm up there. Maybe I'll even talk with somebody for the podcast. As they say in the broadcast biz, tune in next week. And while I go look for my travel toothbrush, let's take a quick break and then get to my interview guest for the week. It's an investment of time, but I think you'll find it well worth your while. Okay, let's modulate and get into the trio section. This week in the trio section, I'm happy to be joined by a gentleman who spent more than a decade as a music teacher and a director of fine arts in one single Massachusetts school district. He's written very thoughtfully about the subject of music education, and I'm thinking of one series of blog posts in particular, and I think it's fair to say he's about to head back to the big house. Please help me welcome to the program, John MANGE. Hello, John.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
I'm looking forward to hearing you make the case for some activities that are near and dear to my heart and the hearts of my listenership as well. So we'll dig into that a bit. But first, let's create a framework for all of that and let folks get a sense about who you are and where you're coming from with a few fact-based questions. So I'll start with my usual starter, which is, what's your primary instrument?
I am a trumpet player. I've been playing since fifth grade.
My next question is always, how'd you get started?
My parents had a disagreement. My mother was a keyboardist, organist, and my father was a brass player, played in the Michigan marching band, trombone. And they could not agree as to whether I would be a pianist or if I would be a trumpet player, because my dad had a trumpet in the closet. So they came to a good compromise, which was that I would do both. So I started in first grade on the piano. Then once it came time to join the Kittredge Elementary School fifth grade band, I was there. I was ready for it. Had a trumpet ready to go and started playing with Mrs. Savory. That was in North Andover, Massachusetts.
So from closing in on that time to the present, what bands have you been active with in your life, whether it's playing or standing in front of them with a stick or whatever?
I guess it all started with the Kittredge Elementary School fifth grade band. And then I moved on to North Andover Middle School bands, North Andover High School, Scarlet Knights marching band. And then that took me all the way to UMass Amherst. I guess I played in the Mass Youth Wind Ensemble in high school as well. That was a fun time with Mr. Musey. College, UMass Wind Ensemble, UMass Marching Band. That's as far as I got as a player. Oh, you know what? I played with the Valley Winds under Brian Messier as well for a few years, which is a lot of fun. That was a special experience. And then picked up the baton and was conducting the bands in Stoughton, marching band, symphonic band. Did the Tuesday Jazz Band for about 5 years.
You did gloss right over the fact that you spent, is it a couple of years as a drum major at UMass?
Indeed, yes. Yep. That was quite an experience.
It's one of the reasons that I tossed out that snarky remark about going back to the big house. And if you're listening and you don't know, it was one of those moments in the UMass band history that everybody knows where they were when they heard about it, but you know where you were because you were there.
Yeah, we were in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. It was boy, that was a night that I will never forget. It was definitely I mean, I don't have words to describe what it was like to be present during that time. Our band director, George Parks, passed away while we were on the way to University of Michigan back in 2010. Felt like getting hit with a bus when you're on tour with band, and then your band director actually passes away there at a show, no less. Yeah, getting hit with a bus is about a way to describe. Not that I would know from personal experience, but if I had to imagine what getting hit with a bus feels like, probably feels about like that.
I know during the Drum Major Academy sessions, Mr. Parks would talk a little bit about he'd have kids raise your hand if you're going to have a new band director this year. And so there was that certain amount of separation anxiety if the previous band director had been a favorite of theirs, and how do you deal with that? But this is taking it to a completely illogical extreme.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, nobody prepares you for anything remotely like this.
I had a little bit of training from my high school days in trying to handle that kind of a transition. We had Mr. Cotter for 2 years, freshman and sophomore year for me. He moved on, joined one of the Navy bands. So we had Mr. Walters the next year. Mr. Walters had been the performing arts director for the district. The position was cut in a huge budget cut, and he basically became the sole band director for most of North Andover. And so he had to take over the high school band and the high school choir, and was also teaching at the middle school in the mornings. It was a completely crazy schedule. So he stuck around for one more year. I think he pretty much decided that he'd had enough. And so then we had Mr. Beatty was our senior year. Mr. Beatty was there for a couple of years. We had a revolving door in North Andover, unfortunately, for a number of years. Mr. Smalley's there now. I don't know him particularly well, but I know he's been there he's definitely brought a sense of sort of continuity and regularity to that program. So yeah, Mr. Parks, certainly a figure of continuity in the UMass program, because he'd been there since the 70s, was that right? 77?
77, yeah.
And his death, of course, a complete shock. And then it was time to find who was going to replace Mr. Parks, which was not an easy decision for anyone who was involved, but it was not an easy transition. I think the drum majors did the very best that we could to welcome Dr. Anderson to the UMass Marching Band, and he did not have an easy job to fill those shoes, but I think he's done an admirable job as well, it being again a source of continuity and constancy, regularity, and ultimately normalcy, because we're he's been there for now what, it's probably 13 years, right?
So there are a number of different ways that we have, just in the last few moments, expressed the concept of grieving losses. And I'm thinking about that not just from that perspective, but also thinking about examples that we've seen fairly recently where budgets need to be cut for various reasons having to do with tax law and et cetera, et cetera. And since I was a wee high school person myself, public education particularly has constantly, it seems, been looking over its shoulder, waiting for the next round of budget cuts to come. I've hinted a little bit at the writing that you did a little while ago, having to do with mounting a defense of large ensembles, large musical ensembles, bands, orchestras, and choirs. Spoiler alert, I think it's a great piece, in part because it's the kind of a defense that I think a lot of people could do well with having in their back pocket. But in the very beginning of this 4-article series you wrote, in the last decade or so, it's become fashionable for some within our profession, the music education profession, to level pointed critiques against school large ensembles, and especially their tacit philosophies of music learning and enculturation. And these critiques, you write, from what I can tell, tend to fall into 4 main categories, and they are financial practicality, exclusivity, irrelevance, and hegemony. I'll be very honest with you, even as a journalism major and a lover of language, I had to go to the dictionary.
Well, that's a funny word, isn't it? Because it has so many different definitions. So you have to be clear, actually, I think, about what you mean by hegemony when you decide to use that term. So I tried to define it when I used it in the blog post.
I think it's worthwhile kind of digging in a little bit to those 4 areas. Now, full disclosure to everyone who's listening, and probably full disclosure from everybody who's listening, we are all a wee bit biased about whether band is worth keeping. We're preaching to the choir or the band. But you talk about financial practicality. It costs too much time and or money to run a large ensemble. That's money that could be used to increase equitable access to music learning for more students. And what's interesting to me, in each of these 4 areas, you bring up subtopics and important points that it's singly and by themselves hard to argue with. It's not as if we're setting up straw men and knocking them over here, but talk a little bit about financial practicality.
So the basic idea of the argument from financial practicality for, let's say, canceling an ensemble music program, the idea is it costs so much to operate any kind of large ensemble. Even if we're just let's talk about the simplest version of this, right? Let's just have a choir. So there's no instruments to buy. You still have to pay somebody to be the choir director. So we're talking presumably a full-time salary. If you want to rehearse your choir and you want it to be more than 30 people, let's say 40, 50, 60 people in your choir or several choirs, then you're going to need a rehearsal space. So that involves, facilities. You probably need a piano of some kind. Could you spend $50 on a keyboard? Yeah, you could. But what are we talking about here? Are we talking about having a robust musical experience, or are we talking about having the bare minimum musical experience? If you want to have a robust musical experience, then your choir is going to have an acoustic piano, preferably a grand piano to rehearse with. And that's going to cost you $80,000 or more. You want to have a piano accompanist for your choir so that your choir director can actually wave their hands? This also requires money. There's all kinds of things that need to go into a choir program. Now let's talk about your orchestra. Got to buy a fleet of cellos. You probably need to outfit at least some of them with violas. You can probably get the kids to rent to own the violins, but you need the basses too. So you got to do all that. Your band, of course, we're band people. We know what it costs to run a band. You got to buy all these instruments. There's some basic things that the kids can rent to own. But by the time you get to the high school level and you're trying to offer a robust high school band experience, you need to buy lower saxophones. You need to buy euphoniums and tubas, French horns. In my opinion, you absolutely need a contrabass clarinet. And you could certainly use oboes, bassoons, a piccolo. Like, these things are necessary to a robust, strong high school band program. The composers write for them. They have to be there. So it's expensive. If that's how much it costs to run a music program, how do we even go about justifying the financial practicality of that?
Hmm.
And the answer to the question is that you need to change your frame of mind. Because if you have a school where you have conceptualized music instruction as optional, as ancillary, as a nice to have, then there's never going to be a world in which you can justify spending tens, hundreds of thousands, if not perhaps millions, if we're talking over multiple years, to fund this music program on taxpayer dollars. Like, why don't we just get their MCAS scores up? Let's just do that instead. So you have to change your frame of reference. You have to be able to say, first of all, there's lots of things that kids do in school that are not necessary. Things like trigonometry. Now, a math teacher might say, I need to be able to teach the students trigonometry because it's a prerequisite to them understanding calculus, and it's an extension of their geometry knowledge. And if they're going to become engineers, then they have to be able to understand these basic foundational concepts of mathematics. Okay, well, how many of those kids are actually becoming engineers? A tiny fraction of them are, right? But is it a reasonable thing to say, well, okay, so there's 1,000 kids in the school, maybe a small fraction of them are going to become engineers. So really, this school only needs to teach everyday mathematics to most of the kids. Is this a reasonable way to think about math education? Heck no. You have to conceptualize math education for rigor. You have to think about it in a way that is asking kids not just to think about what are you absolutely going to need to balance a checkbook and think about your retirement and things that are day-to-day important mathematical things to understand, let's say. But you need to think about mathematics more broadly. You need to think about mathematics as a way of knowing. It's about developing the logical mind. That's what's happening in math class. And so, yes, we're going to teach most kids trigonometry. The kids that we know have the capacity to learn calculus in a classroom setting, we're going to teach them calculus. Even if, and I took calculus in high school, do I use calculus ever? No, never. But I'm still glad that I learned it. So you can find something like this in every single subject. Why does somebody need to study Shakespeare? Why couldn't they study anything else? You can make a totally reasonable argument to say it is not necessary for a student to study Shakespeare. But that's a different question than what does a student need to know to become an informed, educated human being. That's a different question than what is absolutely necessary for a child to know. You can make the same argument about almost any science discipline. Sure, the biologists need to know about the mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell, but do I need to know that personally? Is that important for my life as a music teacher? Heck no, it's not.
No.
Absolutely no, it's not. And for most people, they don't need to know that. But what do I need to know to be an educated person in the world and have a rich human experience when I graduate with a high school diploma? I should know some things about mitochondria and cells, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same thing with music. Music is part of the human experience. It is part of being in the world to engage with music and to have musical experiences in your life. If part of being educated is having exposure and training in as many aspects of the human experience as we can bring into the school environment, then we absolutely need to, it's a necessity. In other words, it's a necessity in that environment.
Now, a lot of the decision makers, a lot of the policy makers are looking at that entire set of paragraphs through an overlay of the cliche is preparing people to be part of the 21st century workforce.
Mm-hmm, sure.
As distinct from preparing people to be well-rounded human beings that can critically think and can appreciate things that are beyond just the counting of beans.
Right.
So that's the hard part.
I mean, and anybody who is thinking carefully about education should realize that the first one that you just said, Rob, is a recipe for scholastic disaster. To say that this place is for training people into workforces.
Worker drones. Yeah.
Then I know. Here's a good idea. Let's teach people how to code. Let's have every single kid in school learn how to code. That's what we would have said 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. But look at the artificial intelligence revolution that we are currently experiencing, you can just tell an artificial intelligence program to write the program for you. Coders are going to be out of jobs pretty soon. Why? Because if you train people in job skills, the skills ultimately go obsolete. You didn't train them to think. You didn't train them to be human beings in the world. You trained them to do a particular job. And after that job gets erased, we all go, oh my goodness, the job's gone. Well, if you have a smart, trained person who has a broad experience, they can adjust to this. The one that you just taught to code, they can't adjust. They have one skill that they've been taught, and now they can't do anything else.
So how much work did the educational system, as much as it was able, based on the constraints that were being loaded upon it, how much did that educational system train the kids' imaginations?
Indeed.
How much did we emphasize? Critical thinking is a term that's tossed around, and it sounds to me, it's always sounded to me a little less based in the world of creativity and imagination. And because I'm the sort of person who marinates in the news and current events and was a journalism major to start out with, I am always appreciating the opportunity not just to read the headline, but to try and figure out what's going on inside of it, that sort of thing. And so whether it's artistic imagination or be imaginative enough to imagine what might happen if this court case is decided this way, for example.
Well, yeah, and a lot of people in education right now, here's a really uncomfortable paradigm shift for many of those people. It would be wonderful to talk about creativity, critical thinking, all these things that are, in fact, the important things that we should be doing in school, but you can't measure them.
Right.
And you can't even presume to measure them. Like, how much creativity do I have? Do I have 100 creativity? Do I have 200 creativity? These are not objective things to be spoken about. They're things that we can't even agree on the definitions of the terms. Nobody in the world can agree on what creativity is. Neither can they agree on what critical thinking is. We can say within the context of, let's say, X study, oh, critical thinking means this for the purposes of this study. But that's not what that word means in the broad schematic of what critical thinking is supposed to be. It's also not a skill that you can really teach. So you're certainly not going to teach it on the MCAS, or we'll test it on the MCAS. But it is the most important thing that they learn in school.
And I'm thinking of my question from years ago, which is, what is the difference between a drum corps that scores 97.125 and one that scores 97? Talk about, can you measure something or can you not? My Lord.
Yep, I have strong feelings about that. I think are gonna be in conflict with a lot of people that listen to the podcast, which is completely okay. We can respectfully agree to disagree, but the idea of scoring music in the abstract is neither philosophically defensible nor reasonable. The fact that we do it is, of course, a reality of what we do here in music, but it's
and in American culture.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's why we do it, and I think there are better ways of going about it than how we presently do, but we participate in the systems that we're given. So,
I'm not sure that I would have imagined this is the way we get to the next bullet point, if you will. But talking about winners and losers. The next bullet point that you talk about, that is in the second of the four parts of the larger article, is exclusivity. And you say large ensembles perpetuate hierarchical structures of music making that select winners and losers through a top-down process driven by musical gatekeepers. There are a lot of buzzwords going on there.
Yeah, lots of things that if you're in the music education philosophy world, your ears are gonna be ringing with buzzwords. This is a problem in large ensembles. It's an issue that we need to resolve. It's also not a reason not to have large ensembles. And that's the main point that I try to make in that portion of the post, is to say, hey, if we can all agree that this is important, then it's not an argument to say that some people benefit more from it or are given more opportunity in this important thing than others. Does not constitute an argument for eliminating the thing. If we can all agree that it's so important that it's problematic that some people receive it and some don't, then we need to find some way to get everybody into it and give everybody equal opportunity in it, at least as much as can reasonably be done. And it may not be perfect, because you know what? The world isn't perfect. but it is something that we should strive for, and it's a fair critique of what we do and how we do it right now. And we as ensemble directors should absolutely be ready to seriously take critique like this, because that's how we get better. But yeah, as far as hierarchies, finding ways to where does hierarchies start? I guess at the ground level, it starts when you start giving solos out to some kids and not to others. It starts when you audition a section and rank them by ability, and then all of your part assignments are according to that ranking. It starts with your district and all state auditions. Are any of these things bad? No, they're not bad. That's a value judgment. They exist. They have benefits as well. If I'm just a superb trumpet player, then it can be in some respects a form of differentiation to give me the more difficult parts and to give me performance opportunities that I'm capable of taking as a more advanced player. But it's also not equitable. And so that's the issue, and we have to find a way to deal with the issue. So creating opportunities for kids who are not at the top of the ranking to shine is how you do that. So you find ways to rotate parts. There are other hierarchies. There's so many hierarchies in large ensembles.
Well, with that, I'm looking at the next couple of bullet points, and I am thinking about a concept that can be applied to looking at both of them, and that is tradition. And as we are well aware, a tradition is anything you do repeatedly and then you forget why you do it. The third of the bullet point subjects that you talk about is irrelevance. The example being, most students today do not listen to the music of these ensembles, the large ensembles, nor do they have meaningful personal connections to them. Talk about an activity in American life that has a history of being, why do we have wind bands in America? Because it's our tradition. So, and the word irrelevance, that's a word that I imagine people could hear in a do we cut the band or do we not situation and easily interpret that as an attack.
It is an attack. I mean, it's absolutely, all four of these bullet points are attacks. I think I've characterized them as much in the blog, but I mean, these are critiques. They are also attacks on the enterprise of large ensembles, and they should be treated as such. That means that they're either legitimate attacks on some aspect of what we do that needs to change, and we need to acknowledge that it needs to change, or they're attacks that aren't legitimate and need to be challenged on those grounds. And irrelevance, I think, is one of the ones that is not legitimate, even if it is a powerful one. So the first reason why the irrelevancy attack is not a properly legitimate attack has to do with the fact that all kinds of things that we learn in school are not relevant to students, at least not directly so. How many kids have a personal connection to the French Revolution?
Very few.
Yeah, a minuscule number. So if we only talk about the aspects of history that kids are going to connect with the minute that they hear about it and go, oh, wow, I really feel strongly about that, right? Then we're not going to be teaching a whole lot of history. And most of it isn't going to be any earlier than the past 50 years. Because that's what kids are aware of at the time that they're being taught. So we teach about the ancient Egyptians. It is important for kids to know about the ancient Egyptians, not because it's relevant to their personal lives today, not because they have a particular personal reason to care about Egypt personally, unless they are themselves, let's say, Egyptian, but because, like we're saying, there are things that you learn in school that are important for an educated person to know. We as a society have agreed to what those things are. And if you as a student, now I'm going to get on all kinds of people's blacklists saying this, if you as a student look at one of these things and say, I just don't find that very interesting, in the end, by the time you're 18, it is your job to figure out what is important about that topic.
Yeah. Why did they teach me that?
Yeah, go to the topic. Go figure out why that's important. If you don't know why the French Revolution is important to you, then go figure out why the French Revolution should be important to you, because it is extremely important for you to know. We don't have to get into why, but we're talking about music right now. But so the first response to the irrelevancy thing is to say, just because students aren't personally connected to band repertoire, or choir repertoire or orchestral repertoire. It does not follow from that observation that those ensembles are not relevant. There could be something relevant about them, even if the kids don't know the music. So we should spend some time investigating to see whether there might in fact be something relevant about them. And it turns out there is. These are the most robust musical experiences that we can give kids in school on a large scale, let's say. Another big piece of the relevancy of ensemble music is that it has to be in person. It can't be over the internet.
As distinct from the remote ensembles, I suppose.
The insane oxymoron of remote ensemble, right? That doesn't make any sense. That's not a robust experience. That's never, ever going to be anywhere near as quality a musical experience as having everybody together in one room. It's different in other places. And this happens in our schools, where our schools are getting filled with screens. Kids are walking around from class to class. They sit in one class, they stare at a screen. They look at the next class, they look at a different screen. Like we're always looking at screens, even if it's not their phone. It might be their Chromebook, it might be the smart board, it might be a television screen. Like they're always looking at screens. In band class, you don't have to look at a screen to get the instruction. You have to pull out a physical instrument and listen to a person in the front of the room give instruction, and then put something up to your mouth and vibrate the air in the room. Yeah. Oh my goodness. What an incredible thing to be able to do as part of your musical education, as part of your education in a school, right? It's worthwhile to do just to pull kids out of the digital world for 42 minutes maybe? We're able to pull them back into this world and do something that can only be done here in the physical place, in our bodies.
Together with other people.
Together with other people, making personal connections with other human beings.
Last and certainly not least, although I will confess again that I got to a dictionary definition that talked about dominant ideas and dominant concepts. In your article, when you bullet point hegemony, you say, these ensembles were created by white men for white men. Their repertoires are mostly composed by white men, though this is less true for choirs, and their continued predominant existence in school music programs is a form of violence and marginalization against students of other identities and their authentic musical backgrounds and lived experiences. And when I read that, I did two things. One, I said, oh, that does make sense. And the other thing is I sat back heavily in my chair and went, oh, we got work to do, don't we?
Yes, we do. Because it gets back really to first principles. It gets back to what are these ensembles? Because they are in fact Eurocentric. They are tied into all kinds of aspects of white and European culture and not other types of culture. It is the case that you can find bands in Africa. When I say band, I mean similar to an American band. You can find that in Africa, in addition to all kinds of other great musical styles and traditions that they have there. But these are absolutely styles that they involve a European mindset about music, conceptualization of what music is, how it interfaces with society. They use European instruments, European music theory. The whole field of music theory right now is doing a hard reset. We all knew that Schenker was a racist, but there's but we're going a little beyond that now in theory. They're really, there's a lot of careful self reconsideration going on in the field of music theory right now, which is healthy, and we need to do that in large ensembles too. Should we eliminate large ensembles, or more to the point, would eliminating large ensembles solve the problem of hegemony, musical hegemony in our public schools? In order to eliminate hegemony, you actually need to eliminate institutions. Institutions are purveyors and instigators and perpetuators of hegemonic forces. If you want to get rid of musical hegemony in schools, then you have to get rid of music in schools altogether. We can have our three large ensemble categories. They can be orchestra, band, and choir, right? Or they can be gamelan ensemble, West African drumming circle, and polka bands. Mm-hmm. But it's got to be something. So it's one thing to say, oh, look, we've got a school right here in X community that would really be well served. They've got an orchestra that just isn't connecting with kids. But a lot of these kids come from a background where X ensemble would be extremely beneficial to those kids in that school. That's one thing on a localized level to be able to say, we're going to create a musical experience that will connect with kids and be meaningful for them because of who they are, because of who their community is. But it's a different thing to try to institute, this is where the hegemony comes in, to try to institute a countrywide, statewide, countywide approach to music education that is fairly standardized for everybody. And to say everybody's going to learn how to do steel drumming, let's say. Okay. Is there anything wrong with steel drumming? Of course not. Should there be steel drumming programs? Absolutely. I think that'd be wonderful. Should we put a steel drumming program in every single school in America? That's an interesting question. It's a question that I don't like to say no to, but I would like anybody who's asking that question to think, what's the purpose of that? Why steel drumming? Why not gamelan? Why not West African Drumming Circle? Why not any number of interesting, beautiful, incredible musical opportunities that we could offer kids? Because we can't do it all. And so there are any number of people that would look at this and say, well, you're just making excuses, John, white male. You're just making excuses for why you just want this problem to go away, and you just want bands to exist perpetually so that you can continue your campaign of violence and marginalization against people that aren't like you. Fair enough. I don't think I'm doing that, but you can think that if you want. But I have a different suggestion, which is to say we have an existing institution. I'm telling you that you can't get rid of the hegemony problem in basically any meaningful way. You can't solve this problem. So why don't we take the existing institution and open it up to everybody? Let's take the existing institution and focus our work not on destroying it so that we can replace it with some other thing that we will hegemonically enforce across the country, because that's what you're going to do.
Yeah.
That's institutions are going to enforce hegemonic thinking regardless of what it is and where. So let's take the hegemony that we can't escape from, and because we know that we need to appeal to a wider group of people than we used to have to historically, let's find ways to make the band, the orchestra, the choir conform to some of those other ways of making music. That's really the solution here. That's what we have to do.
I wonder if it's worth looking at the development historically of jazz, maybe not as a model for how to structure your ensemble program or how to approach what institution gets dominant, but recognizing that the development of jazz in that particular geographic area where, long story short, all kinds of different cultural musical traditions slam into each other in New Orleans, and the European musical structure and music theory is one of those.
Yes.
I wonder if we look at the process of trying to figure out how to craft the existing large ensemble institutions in such a way that it addresses other cultures, it serves people whose heritage is those other cultures and those other backgrounds, is the development of jazz as what has, in a slightly cliched way, but also in a very true way, been referred to as the indigenous American art form. Is that a lens through which to look at that, I wonder?
It is both a template and a cautionary tale. It is a template in the sense of exactly how you talked about, where, yes, it was an intersection of Western instruments, instrumentations, music theories, and African approaches to polyrhythm and rhythmic understanding, and also form in some ways, and putting these two things together into what grew up to be one very interesting and synthesized genre. Volumes have been written about this. It is a wonderful way of seeing how two very, very different sources could come together into a beautiful union. And I do think that there are ways in which that is exactly what needs to happen in American society today. We are always an immigrant nation, and we are always a nation that needs to be thinking about, well, we have new people coming to our shores every single day. My wife is from Brazil. I learned so much from her about my own cultural assumptions. And I think it's really beautiful that our children get to have both an American parent and a Brazilian parent. I think that's really, really special and enriching for them and for both my wife and I both. So, but jazz can be used as a template for thinking about how we can come together as diverse people into one society, because we do all need to live together, and we're all going to be better off if we learn how to live together. That's a really, really important thing for us to develop, using jazz as a template. And yes, let's use the concert band, the orchestra, the choir as vehicles for making that happen, in our schools today. Let's have our ensembles be a musical commons where anybody can come from any background and feel included in the ensemble experience. And as you said, right as we led this off, there's a lot of work to do to get to that point. Cautionary tale, jazz. Anytime that you bring in a marginalized culture into a non-marginalized society, there are risks of assimilation and also of appropriation that have to be treated with extreme care. Jazz education today is the cautionary tale for this. I've been to many jazz festivals in my years. And look, jazz is a Black genre. It's a genre that was developed by Black Americans. But when I go to a jazz festival today in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, who do I see on stage? Who's directing the people on stage? And who are the people rendering judgment on what just occurred on stage? In an enormous majority of the time, the answer is white men. What does that mean? It means that the genre has, to some degree or other, been co-opted. And there's still an enormous amount of, I've used the word deference already, there's an enormous amount of deference in jazz education that goes towards the great minds that developed those styles and the charts that kids play today. And yeah, by and large, if you go to a jazz festival, the music is by Black Americans, right? Not always, but by and large. But the people playing it, the people that picked it, the people that are evaluating whether it was good or not are pretty much, they're pretty white. And that's something that we need to be aware of, even as we engage in this project of inclusion. Well, if it's really inclusion, then why do the people ending up playing all the music end up looking a certain way? That is evidence of some exclusionary dynamics in what actually occurred on the ground. That is something that we need to be very aware of, even as we go into this project of making our offerings more inclusive and more diverse.
I think, toward the end, if I'm not mistaken, of the first of the 4 parts of this series that you wrote something which I think it encompasses that, and it winds us back around to how do we defend the large ensembles that we enjoy so much and that we think are so worthwhile. What you wrote was, we can't lose sight of the fact that when we consider the larger context of public funding, everything really becomes a question of what we do or don't value. And this is crucial to remember because it's usually easier for decision makers to use a lack of funding as an excuse for cutting or not even starting up band or orchestra or choir. What they would prefer for us to forget is the old adage, where there's a will, there's a way. And some places have the will while others apparently don't.
It's all about what we do or don't value. It's all about what the community decides is important to put their money towards, in the decision makers, the ones that are calling the shots, deciding who gets what money in what budgets. There are people making those decisions, and they're making value judgments. And when they decide that it's really important to have a band in their school or a choir in their school or an orchestra in their school, they are going to find a way to make that happen. It's all a question of value. When you look at the large scheme, the macro scheme of public funding in this country, we can talk about public funding in hundreds of billions of dollars. Music education is a drop in the bucket compared to the total amount of money that needs to get spent on any school or any group of schools in K-12 education. So we're not talking about building a space elevator. We're not talking about drilling to the center of the earth. We're talking about something that is actually feasible, can be done if people are willing and value the thing that it is that needs to be done. So it really is all a question of value. It's all a question of what people care about.
With all that in mind, I cannot wait to hear your answers to my traditional stupid little questions that come at the end of this thing that are a whole lot less resume based than the first ones that I asked. So therefore, the first one that I always ask is, what's one of your favorite pieces of band music that you've played?
I'm going to tell you three pieces that I've played, and it's three because I can't pick one. Sorry. The first one has got to be Child's Garden of Dreams by David Mislanka. Oh my God, that music. What an incredible piece of music. The time that I did it was with the UMass Wind Ensemble with James Miller. I'll just never forget this concert and sitting on stage, watching this musical moment transpire. Child's Garden of Dreams is a piece. I can't get into a lot of detail because, we've only got so much time, but it's a piece about a child who ultimately passed away. It's a record of that child's dreams. And the dreams are strange and wonderful and really thought-provoking. But we followed the piece up with an Alfred Reed arrangement of Bach's Komm süßer Tod, Come Sweet Death, which is a song by Bach imagining being on a deathbed and welcoming death after a life well lived. It's a sad piece. But if you think of the way that Child's Garden of Dreams ends, and it kind of peters off into nothing. If you're following the program of the piece, it's almost like the child is passing on. At the end of the piece fades away, the child fades away. It's so sad. We followed that up with this Bach. And if you know Maslanka, you know how connected Maslanka is to Johann Sebastian Bach. Boy, was it a moment. My other two pieces, way less sad. Bells for Stokowski, incredible piece of music. I played it in high school with Mass Youth Wind Ensemble. Another one that I can't get enough of. I want to play it, every day of my life, is the March from Symphonic Metamorphosis by Paul Hindemith. Love that piece.
So to reverse the polarity, is there a piece of band music that you haven't ever played but you would like to?
There are 5 billion pieces of music that I would like to have played but have not. One of them is one of my favorite works for band, and I've never been able to play it. I've listened to it many times. I've forced my students to listen to it. Music for Prague, 1968 by Karel Husa. That piece, oh my goodness. Talk about sad, but also triumphant in a sad way. It's not for everybody, but look it up. If you want a musical tour de force, look it up. Another great piece, and this one is for everybody, Vital Signs by Viet Quang. That's Vital Signs. It's signs, S-I-N-E-S. Vital Signs as in sine waves. This is a new piece. This is just a couple of years ago. It was composed for the U.S. Navy Band and 8th Blackbird, which is sort of this incredible virtuosic new music ensemble. And then another great one I'll never probably get to play myself, Variants on a Medieval Tune by Norman Della Gioia, which is a set of variations based on In Dulce Jubilo, which is a well-known Christmas carol, and it's just a lovely piece, super, super hard and wicked fun to listen to. And then the last piece I have that I wish that I would get to play, but I've never had the chance, is New England Triptych by William Schumann. Like most people in the band world, I have played the Chester Overture, which is the third movement of the New England Triptych, but I have never played Be Glad Then America, and I've never played When Jesus Wept, and those two movements are phenomenal. And I wish that I could play them, but I've never had a chance.
Is there a band that you would like to perform with that you haven't? Either you're the wrong age, or you're in the wrong place, or you don't live in the right period of time?
I don't live in the right period of time, but I would have loved to have played in the Eastman Wind Ensemble under Frederick Fennell in the 50s and 60s when they were doing the Mercury Living Presence recordings. Those recordings are so seminal and so incredible. Just to have played for Fennell and played all those great landmarks would have been so, so cool.
Have you got a favorite band story you want to tell?
I think over the course of my life, I've proven myself to be notorious for forgetting my trumpet trumpets in various locations and to not bring them to things. My mother was driving me to Mass Youth Wind Ensemble at the New England Conservatory, and she drops me off right there on Huntington Avenue. And I go around the back of the car, open the back. My trumpets are not in the car. I am at the New England Conservatory for a rehearsal that is about to begin in 10 minutes, and I do not have trumpets to play. So I go back to my mother and I say, I didn't bring my trumpets to Boston. And she says, I don't know, go find a trumpet. And she drives off to go park the car. Because of course, I mean, it's very logical. If you're at a conservatory, surely there's a trumpet around somewhere that you could find. So I walk into the New England Conservatory completely trumpetless, kind of like trying to figure out how am I going to get a trumpet in the next 10 minutes so that I'm ready for the downbeat of rehearsal. Well, Mr. Musey comes walking in, and I walk up to him, which is not something that I would normally do. But I walk up to Mr. Musey and I say, Mr. Musey, I left my trumpets at home today. I don't have my trumpets. And Mr. Musey looks at me, and I look back at Mr. Musey. We look at each other, and this ever so slight smile crosses the corner of his mouth, and then he keeps on walking right past me. And it is at that moment that I come to the full realization that the fact of me not having trumpets is not a Mr. Musey problem. It is a me problem. So I go sit down in my seat, and I look at the kid next to me. I go, I don't have my trumpets. What am I supposed to do? And he goes, I think Bryant has 2 trumpets with him. And I go, Bryant has 2 trumpets? So I walk up to Bryant, who's sitting at the front of the top of the section. I say, hey, Bryant, I didn't bring any trumpets with me today, but I heard you might have an extra. And Bryant looks over at me and he goes, oh, yes, I do have 2. I have my B flat and my C. Here, take this. And he hands me his B flat. He says, I'll just play my C for rehearsal. And I go, what? Wait a minute, Bryant, give me the C trumpet. I'm the one who didn't bring my trumpets to rehearsal. I should have to transpose, not you. We're in high school, man. But he's just like, oh, no. John, do you know how to sight transpose? And I'm like, not really. And he's like, well, I do. And so I'm like, okay, I guess I'll play your B flat then. So I sit back down and we get into rehearsal, and he has this solo that he's playing, and it's a really hard solo. He misses a note. Mr. Musey stops the ensemble and he says, hey, Brian, I think you need to check your part. You missed a note in your solo. It's actually this. You played at that, or whatever it was. And Bryant goes, I'm sorry, Mr. Musey. It was just a transposition error. And Mr. Musey looks at him like he's trying to. The gears are turning in his head. Like, a transposition error? I'm directing a high school band. Why is there a transposition? And he goes, you're playing your C trumpet because John's playing your B flat. And then my shame is made complete for the entire ensemble.
You ready for this? You certainly seem to bring everything you need to this conversation. Oh. I apologize unconditionally. Are there places online where people can find you?
Yeah, I'm at, that's my website's www.solomusica.net. I'm on Instagram at the John Mange, and also on YouTube as at the John Mange, although I only have like 2 videos on YouTube, so it's not a whole lot there. But
trumpeter, educator, author, and now composer. We didn't talk about that, so we have to talk about that some other time. John Mange, thanks again for this conversation today. So appreciate having you on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Rob.
After this brief pause, more BandWagon. Here comes the dogfight. This week's dogfight is a quick nod to a gentleman whom I met at that old New England Band Directors Institute my very first time there. He was the featured band composer during that summer of 2005, and he ran 2 sessions with a stage full of band directors bearing their primary or secondary instruments. And trust me, you want to hear a band made out of band directors. Just ask Bobby Bergeron. Go back to BandWagon episode 16 for that story. Robert Sheldon was the conductor in question, and he was terrific. Very skilled, but at least as importantly, very personable, very approachable. So I approached him briefly. 3 years or so later, I was the incoming manager for the Massachusetts All-State Band, and I needed to find a conductor, and long story short, I found him. I sent Mr. Sheldon an email saying, "You probably don't remember me, but up in New Hampshire," and he immediately replied to that email, remembering details of our brief conversation that he had no business recalling. He's a busy guy, not to mention sought after. He accepted my invitation, and he was tremendous with the All-State Band kids and with the All-State Band manager. So, a shout out to him. Links to his website and a couple of his compositions are in the show notes. And in a moment, I'll quickly take the coda for this week. Hope you'll stick around. To finish up this week, let's take the coda. For the coda this week, a quick editorial note. I won't always race through the first two and last two segments of this podcast, but again, I didn't want to have this podcast clock in at an hour and 10 minutes or something, and John MANGE kind of forced me to adjust my usual strategy. I hope you enjoyed his thoughts. They definitely freshly inspired me to take a new look at some things I've been doing band-wise, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast in the first place. That's BandWagon for this week. Thanks as always for downloading and listening. BandWagon was written, researched, and produced by your humble host. Musical interludes were produced by Hammerton Media, from source material largely by John Philip Sousa. You can listen to more episodes at our website, heyband.podbean.com. Please give me feedback. Let me know what you like and what you think might change. You can do that using our email address, heybandwagon@yahoo.com. Or leave us a 90-second voice message by going to speakpipe.com/heybandwagon. Be aware that we do reserve the right to include your message on the podcast unless you say otherwise. Those contact links and links to our news items, conversation topics, and my interview guest, John MANGE, can be found in our show notes. Please share the show on social media, and thank you for that. If you enjoy this podcast, get someone else to listen as well. Word of mouth is the best recruiting tool. And to keep up with us every week, subscribe to BandWagon on the Podbean app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate and review. It really helps other people to find the show. For now, take care, stay in touch, stay in tune, and we'll do this all again next week. I'm Rob Hammerton, and don't leave any of your stuff on the music stand, please.